This training is on protecting inland wetlands and water courses, the role of Connecticut zoning commissions. It is planned to take about 1.5 hours, which can be used towards the land use commissioner training requirement under Section 8-4C of the Connecticut General Statutes. My name is Kristen Floberg, a senior planner at the Western Connecticut Council of Governments. I'm joined by Charles Vittich, who is a senior project manager also at WestCog, who will take over presenting about like halfway through this presentation. For those of you who don't know, WestCog is one of the 9 regional council of governments in the state. The council is comprised of the 18 first selectmen and mayors from Greenwich to Westport on our southern border, up through New Milford and Sherman on our northern border. The council of governments are tasked with providing federally required transportation planning and advises on land use, economic, emergency, and environmental planning topics. So this course today is not designed to make you an expert in the administration of inland wetlands regulations. Rather, its purpose is to provide a basic understanding of how planning and zoning commissions can play a critical role in the protection of wetlands within their own sphere of authority. We will review relevant laws governing wetlands, discuss the importance of protecting them, and then the majority of the presentation will be discussing 3 different zoning tools that can be effectively used to protect wetlands resources while simultaneously achieving land use objectives. This chart presents 15 major Connecticut laws that have been enacted over the last 50 years. All of these laws directly or indirectly bear upon the protection of wetlands in Connecticut. The first major law was enacted in 1972, which is an act concerning inland wetlands and watercourses, which remains the foundation of our current wetland protection program in the state. Most recently, as of 2021, all zoning commissions have been tasked with reducing hypoxic conditions in Long Island Sound. This is because wetlands serve as a buffer zone to the state's rivers and streams, and in that capacity, wetlands play a key role in reducing phosphorus and nitrogen discharges into Long Island Sound. Wetlands provide a wide range of functions, including hydraulic, water quality, and recreational functions. A wetland value is nothing more than how humans and other species appreciate the functions provided by this important resource. Wetlands provide a necessary habitat for plants and animals and serve as an important migratory pathway for a range of species. Second is that they provide hydraulic functions like maintaining our shorelines and protecting against flooding during storms. And lastly, wetlands protect the region's drinking water against contamination by allowing the water to be naturally purified by the land before making it into our water sources. There are 2 things that both zoning and inland wetland agencies share as responsibilities. The first is dealing with stormwater management, and the second being erosion and sedimentation control. The approaches taken between the 2 commissions can be different unless there is a coordinated approach relying on common management principles. It is important to point out that a wetland agency can authorize filling of wetlands if there's no other feasible or prudent alternative, while a zoning commission has no such authority. However, a zoning commission can establish setbacks from wetlands, which is not something a wetlands agency can do under Connecticut's wetland statute. Zoning commissions also have the authority to limit specific land near wetlands or development in general in the 100-year floodplain. They can also exclude wetlands from the buildable area or also buildable square, as well as subdivisions. And you also have the authority to adopt regulations to help protect wetlands, such as low impact development principles, repairing corridor setbacks, stormwater management, erosion and sedimentation controls, as well as controls to help reduce non-point sources of pollution, which we'll get into in the following sections of this training. So the focus of this presentation will address how zoning commissions can play a proactive role in protecting inland wetlands, independent of the role played by the Municipal Inland Wetlands and Watercourses Agency. However, we will also review the jurisdictional authorities and enforcement powers of municipal inland wetlands and watercourses. We will also review riparian corridor protections, the buildable square model, and low impact development. First, let's get into riparian corridor protections. So WestCog has actually been working on, let me make sure there's no one in the waiting room. Okay, I thought I saw someone pop up. WestCog has been working on riparian corridor protection strategies for several years, including the Regional Plan of Conservation and Development, which the WestCog Council adopted in 2020, that had 3 specific goals on riparian corridors. The following year, we released a white paper with specific zoning strategies to protect riparian corridors. So if you want to really take a deep dive into this, we have both of those reports on our on the WestCog website. But today I'm going to give an overview of some of the main findings from that report and discuss how zoning commissions can protect wetlands and watercourses. Okay, so for the purposes of this presentation, a riparian corridor is a buffer between the aquatic area, so the main water area, and the upland area. The buffer between is the riparian corridor. It plays an important role in a wide range of other ecosystem services, including creating flood storage, providing migratory pathways for terrestrial and aquatic species. And as mentioned earlier, zoning commissions have the authority to protect this resource. In contrast, wetland agencies have the authority to regulate the buffers under their upland review area, but do not have the authority to protect the buffer. Unlike many of our neighboring New England states, Connecticut does not have a statewide riparian buffer standards. Some states have an automatic, you cannot build within X number of feet from a river. So protection of these buffers are also driven by federal, state, and local government regulations. The federal and state governments focus more on point source discharges. So your wastewater treatment plant, the water that's going directly into a water body, and have no direct authority over land use. So point source regulations in Connecticut are controlled by state stormwater management regulations and the municipal mandate to address municipal separate storm sewer systems, which is otherwise known as MS4. MS4, which you may have heard before, requires each municipality to take steps to keep the stormwater entering its storm sewer systems clean before being discharged into water bodies. On the other hand, non-point source regulations can include contaminants in runoff from impervious surfaces, such as the oil and grease on our roadways, and other toxic chemicals that happen to be released over time, or also from excess fertilizers and herbicides from agricultural land. But the much more likely case in our region are the very large residential lawns that have fertilizers put on them, and also golf courses are a main contributor as well. One of the best strategies to reducing contaminants is allowing for a large enough buffer between these runoff sources and wetlands and watercourses. This allows for the water to be filtered naturally by the earth. This is one of the key reasons the state legislature passed Public Act 21-29 when it made it mandatory for zoning commissions in the state to address how land is used that can contribute to the hypoxic conditions in Long Island Sound. So moving on, so this is a continuation of why to protect riparian corridors. So the state stormwater management plan, like I mentioned before, does not address non-point sources of pollution. Here you can see the algae growth in Holt's Ice Pond in Stamford. And it's one of the reasons the Mill River, which it's connected to, is designated as a restoration priority by DEEP. Fertilizers contain high concentrations of phosphorus and nitrogen, both of which feed the algae growth, and that could lead to hypoxic conditions, not only in the Long Island Sound, but in other watercourses in the region. I'm sure you've seen this in the summer. The algae growth covers some parts of our region, some parts of Candlewood Lake. So it's something that's very important. UConn has done some excellent studies over the years. This one is on the development trends within 300 feet of river systems of the state. As you can see from this slide, the dark red towns have extensive development in the 300-foot riparian corridor buffer zone, exceeding 51% impervious cover in that 300-foot buffer. The most impacted municipalities are along the Connecticut coastline, along I-91 and I-95, and the Route 7 corridor in the region. So related to this is flooding. Western Connecticut has also experienced significant flooding damage over the last 35 years as a result of more powerful storms and increased rainfall intensities, but it also has to deal with the amount of impervious cover that we have in our land. And that's because flood damage happens to be the greatest in areas that are the most urbanized portions of Western Connecticut. You could see here Greenwich, Norwalk, Westport, Stamford. Those all have really high amounts of impervious cover, impacting the flooding rates. So just what thresholds does impervious surface cover affect flooding and the stream water quality? So when impervious cover exceeds about 65% of the land in a watershed, the 100-year flood can be expected to occur on an annual basis. A 100-year flood on an annual basis. Impaired water quality occurs at a much lower level. So generally when impervious cover exceeds 11% of any drainage basin, the greater the impervious cover, the greater the stream quality impairment will be. And we have some really covered drainage basins in the Western Connecticut region. We actually have a map. I didn't include it in this presentation, but it's in our plan of conservation and development where you could see just where it's exceeding these levels. So back to Public Act 21-29. The act explicitly holds all municipalities that are on or contiguous to navigable waterways draining into Long Island Sound to be responsible for protecting the ecosystem and habitat of Long Island Sound. The specific concern is in reducing the hypoxia, which is the depletion of oxygen in the sound, but it also is for reducing pathogens and toxic contaminants and floatable debris as well. This last section here, section C, it says that basically that municipalities provide that such municipalities zoning commissions consider the environmental impact on Long Island Sound's coastal resources. And coastal resources is defined in 22A-93, and this is for any proposal for development. It's defined as coastal waters of the state, their natural resources, related marine and wildlife habitat, and adjacent shorelands, both developed and undeveloped, that together form an integrated terrestrial and estuarine ecosystem. However, the key word here is actually in this first section where it says navigable waterways. Looking further into that definition was it changed in 2020 with an EPA ruling. And I will go to the next slide. Here we go. So the EPA ruled that the tributaries of navigable waterways that are hydraulically connected to downstream river systems and are the causes of pollution of the waters of the United States are also subject to the EPA Clean Water Act regulations. So this means basically all municipalities in the state of Connecticut are responsible. Every municipality in Connecticut has a tributary that is hydraulically connected to downstream river systems that drain into Long Island Sound, which makes hypoxia also a federal water compliance issue for all towns. So I did want to also go into what kind of wetland activities are not regulated. So they're as of right. So as of right activities include grazing, farming, nurseries, gardening, and harvesting of crops and farm ponds on parcels that are 3 acres or less and are essential to farming operations. Could also be activities conducted by the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protections, boat acreage and mooring, outdoor recreation that does not disturb the wetlands, and as well as fire emergency purposes, so taking the water out for a fire emergency, and as well as installing dry hydrants by the fire department. There are some caveats to these as of rights activities. First being road construction or the erection of buildings that are not directly related to farming operations. The relocation of water courses with continual flow, filling, or reclamation of wetlands or water courses with continual flow. They specify that the clear cutting of timber is not a farming activity. So no clear cutting of timber unless it is for the expansion of agricultural cropland. And then there's also no mining of topsoil, peat, sand, gravel, or other similar materials. So in 2012, the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection mapped the statewide phosphorus yields. So with the exception of the very dark blue areas, you could see there's not very many of them in the Western Connecticut area, shown on the map that represent very low levels of phosphorus yields. Most of Connecticut has high to very high phosphorus levels in the green and the light green and the darker green colors here. These high levels seen in the region are not the sole responsibility of any one municipality, because like I was mentioning before, all of our waterways are connected hydraulically, so everything flows downstream. So it's the contributing factors of everyone who's contributed to the water quality along the way. So this map here shows that the municipalities that have adopted some form of riparian corridor requirements in their zoning regulations. This map distinguishes municipalities that have developed these regulations to focus on flood storage concerns, which is shown in red on this map, versus water resource concerns, which is shown in green. So this map shows the range of upland review areas for watercourses in Connecticut. As you could see, 12 of the region's municipalities have adopted the 100-foot upland review area, which is shown in the light green color. At the state level, though, 84% of all of the municipalities in the state of Connecticut have adopted an upland review area of at least 100 feet. There is a higher standard, though, for concern in public water supply watersheds. There's a large area of the region that is public water supply watersheds that drain into reservoirs, and they're used for drinking water purposes. So even public water suppliers are not allowed to sell land within 100 feet from their water courses. But there is a big gap, though, because 67% of the land in water supply watersheds is privately owned, which means the suppliers are not able to protect what is going on in those areas. So this is an opportunity for zoning commissions to fill in that gap specifically. And one thing I did mention um, is that some may say, why don't we just use mechanical water filtration and purification if things get bad, right? Um, and our answer to that is that it would be far more expensive putting in treatment plants than it would to be just to employ some really good land use controls and allow for the land to do what it does best. So I did want to talk more specifically about buffer zone widths and the type of plant cover that is used. So you'll see that the width of a riparian corridor has a direct bearing on its pollutant attenuation value. This study here from 1995 found that a distance of 93 feet with grass and forest cover had the best reduction in sediment loads, nitrogen, and phosphorus reductions. So as you increase the buffer here, you're having a decrease in all of the sedimentation controls. But one of the main things too is thinking about what kind of plant cover is in that area. If it's just grass, I mean, it's better than pavement, but a lot of grass can be compacted over time. You'll probably notice this and some lawns that you've seen where the water is just pooling and it cannot drain properly. Uh, and it's even worse sometimes if that is on a slope. It will the runoff from a storm will just go right over it and into the water. But having some forested areas, different kinds of plants can help slow that runoff down. So this figure here shows how riparian buffer widths affect desired ecosystem services. So wildlife habitat, flood mitigation, sediment removal all have a very minimum width of around 50 feet buffer, but it's best to expand that to 100 up to 250 feet for even better outcomes. So to summarize, our first zoning tool is that riparian corridors that buffer along rivers and streams can dramatically reduce surface water pollution, counter thermal pollution of rivers, and also create migratory pathways for a wide range of terrestrial and marine species. This can dramatically reduce the phosphorus, nitrogen, and total suspended particles in the region's waters. This works when buffers are at about 100 feet or more and include tree canopy protections. Impervious surfaces are minimized. The ground cover is maintained, and there's limited soil compaction. Some examples of municipalities that have adopted effective riparian corridors include Salem, Connecticut, Essex, Haddam, and Willington that you can look into further for some model regulations. And then before I turn over the presentation to Charles for the second half, I wanted to give everyone about a 5-minute break since this is a 1.5 hour long training. I don't want anyone to get too antsy, and we're able to still pay attention. So we will be back in about 5 minutes, which is how about back at 7:30? Okay, thank you. Okay. 7:30, so I think we'll get started again. So Charles, if you want to take it away from here, that would be great.
Okay, let me just find my screen again. I'm now looking only at myself. So let's see where I get that back to. Where should I be here? Oh, where is that? Wait a second. Okay, here we go. Back in business. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. And thanks, Kristen, for that really good introduction to the issues that we're dealing with today. One thing I want to mention is I'm a planner going back many years. And the first and fundamental element of any management, including resource management, is planning. And planning and zoning commissions really are in a position to do resource protection planning in a way that inland wetland commissions or agencies, their equivalent terms actually, are not capable of doing. They're really project-based. What I want to start here with is what's called the buildable square. I'm sure some of you are aware of the buildable lot concept. The buildable square is basically a variation of the buildable lot, but it's related to a specific subcomponent of the lot, which needs to be protected for a variety of reasons. The primary reasons would be the buildable square component of the lot is where the house will go, where the well will go, where the septic system and leaching field will go, and it will also be a place that needs to be protected from having wetlands or floodplains, because those would be incompatible with the leaching field as well as the footprint of the house. The buildable lot concept is one that applies to an entire lot of keeping by exclusion floodplains, wetlands, and steep slopes. But the buildable square is a more precise surgical tool that only deals with what's needed to make it buildable. Excluding all wetlands from a site may not be necessary to make a functioning septic system leaching field, or even for that matter, for the footprint of a building, especially if lots are larger. But the buildable square concept is not limited to suburban or rural locations. In Connecticut, we even have urban locations where there's septic, where there's sewers and water, where the buildable square is used to exclude wetlands or floodplains in areas where there may be sewer and water. So it is not a limited concept. And if you want to go to the next slide, Kristen, since we're working as a team here, folks, want to give you an idea of who's doing what. In Connecticut, there are only 73 municipalities that have actually used the concept of a buildable lot or buildable square, or alternatively, some of them call them buildable area. And indeed, there are some that call it buildable rectangle. And indeed, one town, which happened to be Greenwich, calls it a buildable circle because they use a circle rather than a square or rectangle. In this particular map, you'll see the ones in blue are those that have established an exclusion of wetlands and watercourses. And this is what true planning is about, is recognizing to do it in the first place to avoid wetlands by establishing either through a lot or an area or square or a rectangle, or in the case of Greenwich, a circle that does not have wetlands, floodplains, or steep slopes. This is one of the growing areas of interest in many municipalities. Not all towns have done it at this point, but many towns have caught on to the value of this concept. And in Western Connecticut, you can see that we have a goodly number of them that have done so already. So this is an excellent tool that is a precision way of avoiding wetlands. And to the extent that this is integrated into plan unit development or in subdivision design, then we've nipped the problem of wetland impacts in the bud because we planned them out from the get-go. Now, lots of record are another story, but for planning for this point forward, for where there are new lots developed through subdivision or even through plan unit developments, the tool has extremely important value. So we can go to the next slide, Kristen. Okay, so what really is the difference between a buildable lot where the regulations apply to the entire lot, not just to a portion of it? And as you can see from this, essentially, there is really no fundamental difference in what goes into the concept of a lot level or square level. The only difference is that the buildable square is a subcomponent of the lot. And depending upon which municipality we're dealing with, some of them ensure that the buildable square is within, not inside of or overlapping with the side, rear, or front setback areas. Now, not all towns have been thinking straight on it, because fundamentally, even if you don't put it in your buildable square definition, essentially you would realize that you already have a regulation on that. So in some ways, it's duplicative to say you can't put the square in an area where the setbacks are there. However, if you do something like that, then you would have an interpretive issue within your zoning regulations as to which takes precedence. So that would be an issue that would have to be visited on a specific case basis and really lead to a revision of the regulations. One of the advantages also of the buildable square is it makes it easier for the public health department or the health districts when they have to come in and look at what's been established. You're already doing some of the legwork of what they have to do because there are certain requirements that they have in terms of what the size of the septic system leaching field must be, the size of the reserve system that must be, the separations that you must have from wetlands by the public health code, and the separations that you have to have between the leaching field and the well system. All of those are laid out in the public health code, but more importantly, while the public health code has setback standards, zoning commissions also have setback standards. And as long as the zoning commission has standards that meet or exceed the public health code, that is acceptable. In fact, I would like to emphasize to each of you that the public health code that we have today actually is inadequate to meet the concerns that Kristen just raised, because we know septic system leaching fields in various types of soil conditions, especially highly permeable soil with down gradients that go right into a water supply, a reservoir, or wetland, can have a hydraulic conductivity with that down gradient water supply, which leads to inadequate attenuation or remediation of the phosphorus and nitrogen that is being discharged from the leaching fields. Connecticut has much more permissive standards for setbacks from leaching fields to watercourses than any state in New England except for Massachusetts. And the reason for this is that we need to renovate our regulations on this point. There are a number of people who are working on this issue. We do anticipate more changes, and I think the public health folks are aware of this concern, because if you have high volumes of leachate coming out of a septic system, let's say based on a 9-bedroom house or a large volumes in very highly permeable soils, you're going to have a much longer discharge of that water in terms of distance from the leaching field to the watercourse than you will if it's only a 3-bedroom house and then you're dealing with a different kind of soil condition, which doesn't lead to its quick discharge to the watercourse. That's one of the reasons that the state of Maine has actually established setback standards that are volume-based. The volume of the discharge of the leachate has a direct bearing on how far it will go. And Connecticut may have to go that way to be more consistent with the science. You can go to the next slide, Kristen. Now let's take a look at the various concepts. The first one is a buildable lot concept. And in this picture, the lot is a little bit bigger than the three on the other side. And the reason for it is that if the standard lot size had no wetlands, the only way you can make it work is to have your lot larger, which is that little squiggle in yellow, which is the wetland. So in order to meet the standard in some of our municipalities in the state, about 12 of them, the wetland must not be within the minimum buildable lot. So if it's a 1 acre lot, hypothetically, they might have to have 1.2 acres if somehow the wetland could be shown to be beyond the minimum standard. So it's not a precise tool. Now, if you get into the buildable square, the buildable rectangle, or the buildable circle, as long as those square, circle, and rectangle have no wetlands, then you've actually accomplished the mission, as long as the key, which we'll get into, is the key minimum size for the square, rectangle, or circle is sufficient to establish a viable location for your septic system leaching field, the buildable, the building footprint, the well, and the reserve system. So that's where the science comes into it, because it's all soil-based ultimately to know what that capability is. However, on a planning level, if a municipality is going to establish these kind of buildable square concepts on a zoning district basis, there's a couple ways to do it. And one is to establish the minimum based on worst case percolation rates as to what the minimum buildable square should be. Or alternatively, it can be a menu scenario based on the soils and the number of bedrooms. So there are some potential for going that way, but in Connecticut, the towns that are doing it have established a standard size for the square, the rectangle, to make it simpler for how things are done. So it's more of a worst case analysis. You can go to the next slide. So why have buildability concepts emerged? Well, if you've been around a while, and I sometimes think I have been, and I guess I have, this gets down to, well, septic systems don't last forever. And I don't know if you've had the experience, but I've gone through septic system renovation projects. And of course, I started in a period of time where there were no reserve systems. As you know, that's not something that going back in time we had. It was something that was actually a revision to the public health code to put in a reserve system. And it's actually a revision to the public health code to even have filtration systems, all which help to extend the life of a septic system. Septic systems do not last forever. A very important study that was done by Soil Conservation Service many years ago found that the half-life of a septic system is 27 years. What that means is that half of them will fail in the first 27 years. Some could fail in the first 2 years, some 5 years, but by the 27th year, half of all the systems in a town will fail. The other half will then have a half-life, which means that the remaining, let's say you had 150 fail by the 27th year. The next 27 years, the remaining 50, 25 of those will expire after that period of time. So that's a little bit like the half-life of radioactive materials. It's the same basic principle. So the other thing that's very important to understand is what we do in the beginning goes on for, well, in this case, 27 years, 54 years. What we do in planning with the way we set up a lot, the buildable square, is a significant long-term investment in thinking about water protection principles and wetlands in particular. There's an aspect to this is, like everything else, I say to people, When was the last time you checked maintenance on your toaster or your microwave? I joke about this because we have so many technologies today and they all require maintenance. We have now along the coast of Connecticut a goodly number of towns that now mandate the clean out of their septic systems using a standard contractor who goes to every municipality's a single family residence that has a septic system and cleans it out on a 3-year cycle. In Western Connecticut, most of our towns are not doing that, but that is a very critical long-term tool for protecting our wetlands, as well as for ensuring that our septic systems are actually functioning properly. By not doing that, of course, because of the discharges of effluent, nitrogen, and phosphorus in particular, we can, as a result of not having a program at a municipal level, lead to the eutrophication of the lakes, streams, and rivers. We know Candlewood Lake, we know other lakes in our region, as Kristen showed, have become eutrophied, which basically means that they've been depleted of oxygen because of the enormous amount of nutrients that have been discharged into these waters. And much of this is legacy of the early 1900s, because even the public health department, which started, well, back in the late 1800s, was primarily focused on communicable disease at that time. And it was only through leaps and, piecemeal methods of getting forward over time that we ended up with public health code, which has taken a much closer look at what septic systems have done to our water supply. For the problems that we have today, they're rather small compared to how egregious our water systems were polluted during the period of the Industrial Revolution right up into the 1950s. So while we have a long way to go because of the consent agreement with EPA, which requires the state to deal with the water quality degradation, in many respects, looking retrospectively, we've made an enormous problem because our water systems were basically used as sewers for many, many years. So we have made great progress. And for those of you who wondered whether or not the buildable lot or the buildable square concept is legitimate, because the Connecticut General Statutes for zoning do not explicitly use that term, the Connecticut Supreme Court in several cases, and this one is Semino versus Zoning Board of Appeals, in the case at Woodbridge, has upheld the right of zoning commissions to have the buildable lot concept. And they've even gone so far as to say that zoning boards of appeal have no authority to modify a buildable lot as established by the zoning commission. So this is an established right for zoning commissions to actually use this tool for resource protection purposes. What I want to do now, Kristen, if you go to the next slide, I want to give you some examples of what some municipalities have done. You'll see Fairfield and Bridgeport as the two that I'm picking on here. And I'm going to read this one too, the Fairfield, Connecticut zoning regulations, just to so you get a flavor of how they vary. The area of the minimum square required for each lot shall be exclusive of wetlands, watercourses, conservation easements, or any other restriction other than setbacks, which would prevent actual house construction within the square. Now you'll notice here, they've gone further. They have the conservation easement. And you'll find across Connecticut, because we do not have a zoning clearinghouse in Connecticut with zoning. And as a result, you can argue that this is leads to creativity. It also leads to a lot of inconsistent approaches. But it also is the value of inconsistency is that if we learn from each other's mistakes, we can move forward. Now, in the case of Bridgewater, they've been more explicit about why they're doing it, which I think is a very important point when you go into a court of law. Let's read that one. In order to facilitate lot development and lessen the risk of post-development problems, such as septic system failures, this is a key point, poor drainage and erosion, each lot must contain a sufficient area of buildable land such that all state in town codes, regulations, and ordinances pertaining to driveways, septic systems, wells, and inland wetland watercourses may be satisfied. I would give them an A on that one. I think they've taken it because what you've done is you've established the legislative history within the definition. And that is very important when you go to court. I've been an expert witness in land use and zoning issues in a number of cases in Connecticut, and many of them rotate about the actual definition that the judge has to look at to make his decision or her decision. You can go to the next slide. So we'll take a look at a couple others. This one is interesting because Newtown has actually recognized what many other towns have not, is that there's a difference between the minimum square in this one, which is lots of record, and I'll read it, a square each side of which is the length prescribed for the zone in which the lot is situated and which is capable of being drawn entirely within the lot's boundaries and behind the minimum front setback line of a lot in said zone. No more than 20% of the minimum square should be classified as inland wetlands as determined by field survey. Now, at first, when I looked at it, I said, well, why did they do that? Why don't they just get rid of it? But really, when you read the next one, a section, you realize that this first paragraph is about lots of record, because section 7.02(110), any new lot created after September 16, 2002 shall contain an area of land at least equal to the minimum lot area in acres for the zone in which it's located, exclusive of wetlands, watercourses, vernal pools, and another key one, FEMA 100-year floodplains and natural slopes of 25% or greater. So what we have is actually maybe A+ compared to the last one, because what they've done here is to recognize the distinction between lots of record and lots that are being developed from this point forward, being September 16, 2002. So this is an example of why looking at what other municipalities have done can be very instructive, especially if you're looking at trying to make your regulations litigation proof, which is, of course, a tall tale, since litigation is something that's difficult to stop, but at least your chances are much better in a court of law. So you can go to the next one. So in the case of New Milford, I'll read this one too, so you get a flavor of how this is done. The total horizontal area within the lots in determining compliance with the minimum lot area requirements of these regulations, areas consisting of wetlands, watercourses, natural slopes in excess of 25%, portions of the lot less than 25 feet wide, or the private right-of-way leading to the rear lot shall not be included. So this one is an example which is not the buildable square. It's designed for the aesthetics and the form fitting of lots, because without a buildable square or buildable rectangle, you can have a lot that looks like a barbell, which is very wide on one end, wide on the other, but as slim as a pencil in the middle, and still meet the minimum lot area. And as you know, that creates problems for development. So this is another example of considering how other towns have looked at the concept of buildable square as not just a water resource and wetland resource protection, but one that enables development that considers other options and other considerations, such as inadequate space for development between the two side setback areas. You can go to the next slide, Kristen. And in the case of Weston, this regulation that Weston has is not a buildable square. It's a little different. It's really a regulation that's based on the buildable lot. So this is an important thing to keep in mind. A buildable lot standard, which does not look at the buildable square, means you may be asking for too much development constraints, because you're looking at constraining more of the resource protection than you might need to do if it was focused on the buildable square or rectangle. And I'm not going to read this one, but basically you have a limitation. That this particular definition would fit into that where you saw the 4 diagrams that I showed, the one on the far left. This would be really the buildable lot concept. Anyway, we believe that the more surgical and the more precise approach is the better approach. It's not that this one doesn't accomplish the same objective, but the question is, at what cost does it lead to in terms of overall housing costs or land development costs? Okay, now let's go, Kristen, to the a summary slide here. Now, this is a little bit confusing, but let me just read the first one. I put the codes in there because I used it in my analysis, but the minimum buildable area uniformly applied is number 1 at top. There's 25 towns in the state of Connecticut that are using a minimum approach to the buildable area across the entire community. And if you look down, there are a couple others that are uniformly applied. So if you added them all up, which I happen to have done, you've got about 33 out of that 73, which are using it one form or another, whether it's a rectangle or a square. 33 out of 73 are using that approach. So that's the most common approach, is to uniformly apply it across the entire community. But there are some municipalities that have done it by zone, as you can see. In 28 of the municipalities, if you count them all up, out of the 73, have varied this buildable square concept by the zone. Now, there's arguably some benefit to that if there are differences in the lot sizes or there are differences in soils within the different zones. For example, soil-based zoning is used by a half a dozen towns in Connecticut. And so if they've done it more surgically that way, that may work. So you have those 2 basic concepts. And then finally, you have line 3, minimum buildable area equals minimum lot size. So 12 municipalities in Connecticut have done that. And that would be an example of the one we just looked at, which is Weston, and 11 other municipalities across the state. So is there one size that fits all? I dare say I wouldn't want to say that at this point. I think a lot of thought was put into these, but I also found that going through the regulations of the entire state on this issue, there's opportunity to learn from some of the ones that have perhaps had more field experience, or perhaps just been in the saddle longer on some of the issues. So it's one of the first things that you learn with zoning is look at what the neighbors do in terms of zoning. And in my case, I've always looked at every neighbor we have in Connecticut, all 167 towns with zoning, because it gives us a perspective of what's working. And the overall picture is the minimum buildable square concept, or the rectangle, are an emerging concept in Connecticut, which is catching on in many places. We didn't have any of these concepts back in 1987. That was not even in the ball game. And a lot of this was driven by a ballet between the zoning commissions, health districts, and the public health code, where the concept here, protecting resources at the same time of making septic systems more viable and not failing, work well together. Okay, so let's summarize. We'll go to the next slide, Kristen. So this is a summary of what we've just been talking about here. So we really want to create a sufficient wetland-free land within a buildable lot for proper functioning of the septic system and leaching fields. And of course, the benefits we've been talking about, obviously wetlands is a key component of it, but as Kristen said, particularly in the area of rivers, streams, watercourses, if they're going into Long Island Sound, each of the municipalities in Connecticut has an affirmative responsibility to address this issue to avoid the hypoxic conditions, and perhaps to raise the ante if a municipality has watercourses that directly discharge into a public water supply reservoir, then the significance of providing for buildable square concepts in that portion of the town, which falls within a public water supply watershed, becomes all the more important. Based on our analysis of worst case conditions, using a 3-bedroom house, typically a buildable square should be about 27,000 square feet in size. And this is for a 3-bedroom. The report that we've recently released on the buildable square concept provides a direct correlation between the number of bedrooms and the size of the buildable square under worst case conditions. So this is a 3-bedroom scenario that you see in the lower left as far as the techniques. And I'd highly recommend New Milford, Haddam, and Old Lyme as examples of looking at the buildable square. And of course, from the ones we talked about earlier, we discussed some of the examples that had some real benefits as well in the earlier slides there. So now we're going to go on to our final section, which is called low impact development. So basically, low impact development is a nature-based solution to protect wetlands and watercourses, and it rests on the use of low impact development strategies that reduce stormwater by minimizing impervious land cover, maximizing tree canopy cover, and adopting such concepts as green roofs and bioswales and parking lots. The LID is the acronym for it, low impact development. It aims to maintain, and this is the key, pre-development hydrology as closest source to the possible, so that the post-development event creates water discharges that are really no different than the pre-development event. And that can be a tall order unless nature-based solutions, low impact development strategies are looked at in the planning phase. In essence, low impact development is understanding the sponge value of the land. And the sponge value of the land is not just the soil. One of the critical resources is the underground network of root systems of the trees and of all of the bacterial bacterial commensal, and commensal means in harmony with the tree root system, which actually activates the nutrients that a tree may absorb. So there's a whole world underground, which is part of the success of low impact development, because it's not just having a land that's grassed over. It's a question of what's underground, because the root systems are what draw the water into the tree systems, and the bacteria that are in harmony with those root systems are kind of a team player with the roots. So one of the things that have come out, and this is where the science has come in, when you get over 11% impervious cover, water degradation occurs. When you get over 25% impervious cover within a watershed, this is at a watershed level, the water pollution becomes significant. And of course, as you know from the slide that Kristen showed, some municipalities in Connecticut are over 50% impervious. They are going to have other issues, and those are usually urban areas, in terms of how to store water when there isn't any open areas. And that's a whole engineering strategy that some of our communities like Stamford are already dealing with. So let's go on to the next slide. So basically, there are 3 basic approaches. And it's a little bit like the principles of pollution prevention. You start with the protective strategies. That means maintaining tree canopy cover within the watershed, and more specifically within the development that may be for you as a zoning commission member. And of course, protecting the wetlands and watercourses from development, including the upland review area, which actually is a riparian corridor. But in Connecticut, the riparian corridor is as Kristen mentioned, is a regulated area, not a protected area. And yet, we do have the ability through zoning to protect it, particularly because of the mandate of Public Act 2129. So reducing impervious cover is the first step. And I think everyone should know state of Connecticut just about a month ago issued the Stormwater Quality Manual 2024, which replaces the Stormwater Quality Manual issued in 2004. And it's actually a major improvement because that Stormwater Quality Manual makes low impact development the first essential step before any stormwater management plan is implemented. So that's a very important element of it. Finally, in cases where low impact development is not possible to complete the goal of reducing the stormwater to pre-development hydrologic conditions, then we have the issue of detention basins, retention basins, and other engineering strategies, underground infiltration tanks that may come into effect. But ultimately, what we do in the beginning through the analysis of low impact development is the key to reducing the stormwater and nutrient discharges that go into our waters, whether they go into Long and Sound or into the water that we drink. So we can go to the next slide. Now I'm repeating this slide that Kristen went into, and it's one of the reasons for repeating this slide is that almost all the municipalities in Connecticut who have directly connected discharges, that means a pipe that goes directly into a water body, that's a point source. That's a definition of what a point source is. It's a pipe discharge into a water supply. The National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, which is called NPDS at the federal level, regulates any point sources. It's only recently that the federal government has established stormwater discharges as point sources, as municipalities may have. But what they've done under the municipal separate storm sewer system is that in order to address the problems of the hypoxic conditions in Long Island Sound, these systems need to be disconnected or ways of eliminating the discharges that those systems have into our waterways. Now, one of the things that's most interesting about this general permit that's been established, the MS4 permit, that's the acronym for low, is that they've mandated low impact development. So here it is, the federal government has only marginal controls over land use. They only have controls over point sources. But what they've done in the general permit, and our towns in Western Connecticut are subject to the MS4 permit, is that they say that you must have low impact development regulations as part of the mandate of the MS4 general permit, which means it's getting the federal government through the state government, because the MS4 general permit is a state general permit. They now have forced our municipalities across the state to develop low impact development standards. So we have two drivers. One is the MS4 permit, which mandates that all towns must develop low impact development standards. The other one is the guidelines from the 2024 Stormwater Quality Manual, which are only guidelines, but the general permit is a regulation. So we have some drivers that are occurring here. You can go to the next slide, and I'm going to just show you what this is specifically. So the MS4 permit says this: the permittee shall establish an ordinance by law, regulation, standard condition of approval, or other appropriate legal authority that requires the maximum extent practicable that a developer or contractor seeking the permittee's approval shall consider the use of low impact development and runoff reduction site planning and development practices part of the consideration of other practices in the permittee's land use regulations, guidance, or construction projects requirements to meet or exceed those LID and runoff reduction practices identified in the Stormwater Quality Manual. Now, interestingly enough, when this came out in October, this particular language you see here, It was about the same time that Stormwater Quality Manual came out. So it's like a 1-2 punch. And what we're seeing here is that there is a strong move to move forward on this, but nobody's talking about the benefits of this to the wetlands and watercourses. Of course, we are today. And so education is a key variable, given that we have these regulatory impositions coming upon our municipalities. So you can go to the next slide. Now, in order to help you to understand how early a stage we are in Connecticut, all the towns that are in red have no low impact development regulations. And as you can see in Western Connecticut, we have quite a few still that don't have them. But like anything, we do have some that encourage it, all the yellow towns. So we have a number that do that. And then we actually have some that require it to the extent that it's feasible. And that's in the ones that are blue. So in this case, if I read that correctly, New Fairfield would be an example. And of course, you can see where the other ones are located. So we have varying degrees of involvement, but really all of the red towns need to get to the yellow color, become encouraged, and all the yellow towns need to go a little bit further and become the green towns so that they actually are consistent with that general permit. So these are major steps that are emerging, but without education about this at all levels, and it's not just zoning commission members, but even our chief elected officials, and they do to a large extent know about this, but the specifics may not have been brought to their attention. So all of these things ultimately all driven by one thing, the consent order between the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the state of Connecticut. So you can go to the next slide. So let's just talk a little bit about what some of the municipalities are doing in Connecticut. From my analysis of what's going on, what is triggering low impact development in our municipalities across the state? Well, the specific driver, the most specific, and it varies by the dark blue being driven by the stormwater management plan of a municipality, or the light blue is other development concerns that may be there, because some towns have actually not developed stormwater plans in their zoning, but they have low impact development in their zoning. It's more a question of what they want to call it. But specific land uses are one of the major drivers, and specifically commercial and industrial development are the ones where we're seeing this low impact development concept being applied the most commonly. But the other one, which is actually more consistent with historical case law at the federal level, is land disturbance. When you have a disturbance of a certain amount of acreage, and this particular slide, there's, well, there may be only in the order of, I forgot the total number here, but it's in the order of 100 or more different categories. Each one of these bar chart items is a summary of multiple different ways local governments have done it. Some may say an acre of land disturbance. Some may say only anything that's over 1,000 square feet of disturbance. So what we're dealing with is the Wild West in terms of where the standards are, and I anticipate this will change with time. And the third one is impervious cover. Those are very significant. In fact, the other one is the water resource protection. Those top four are really the most important drivers. Not that the other ones aren't, but many of the other ones that are below, such as wetland permits / impacts or driven by permit type, are just aspects of what's in the top four. So this is still an emerging area of zoning development in Connecticut, but it's also very important to understand that this supports the protection of wetlands. So you can go to the next slide. So we can close this section out on the low impact development, just to understand that the goal of the low impact development strategy is to maintain or replicate pre-development hydrology using small scale controls to manage runoff as close to its source as possible. And of course, wetland protection and reduced flooding are there. And it's really a natural systems approach, which even in an urban area can include things like green roof concepts and rain gardens and other bioswales and parking lots. All of those are examples of how the concept can be applied regardless of how dense your community may be. Best practices, believe it or not, some of our more rural towns have jumped on this quickly. Morris and Winchester, Guilford and New Fairfield are examples of towns that have actually really considered leaders in terms of what their regulatory strategy is. Okay, so now just to close out the section, we're going to talk about violations and enforcement in the wetland arena. It's important to understand some of the issues here. First of all, only the designated agent of the Inland Wetland Agency or Commission, as you want to call it, may enter public or private property. But it's important to understand the wetland agent does not have an authority to go into anyone's private residence, nor do any other people have the authority to do it. But the key is their only role is for inspection and investigation of possible violations of wetland regulations. Based on our analysis of what goes on in Connecticut, most of the towns are not doing very many investigations, partly because of resource constraints. Just the amount of time that the wetland agent is available and the amount of workload that they have. So enforcement is driven by resources and also by, in reality, by what neighbors may say about what their other neighbor is doing with activities that may be questionable, especially if they're bothering the neighbor who's making the phone call. Now, there's two things to understand. There's penalties that come into anytime a violation is identified, and the violations can be dealt with in one of two ways. One is through fees and one is through fines. Almost all towns are dealing with it on a fee basis. And what we found in Western Connecticut is about a half a dozen of our towns have actually created a concept of a wetland permit based on a corrective action. In other words, let's say the permit is $200 for a normal wetland permit to do something. If they've identified a wetland which is being violated or a wetland permit which is being violated, then the corrective action permit might be double, triple, or more than the normal permit. So it's actually serving a quasi-fine approach. But a fine system is different. It requires a separate ordinance, whereas a fee is within the normal control of the wetland agency, but fines require a municipal ordinance. So it is not as commonly seen to take that approach. Now let's go to the next slide. So the role of the designated wetland agent is critical. And what's normally goes on is the agent is responsible for identifying violations wherever they may be. But most of the time, it's going to be looking at the violations that occur by those who receive a permit who are not following the conditions imposed on that permit. And in those cases, then the issue is that the Inland Wetland Commission or agency issues a cease and desist order. One of our challenges, of course, is the staffing to deal with these issues. And as I mentioned earlier, some of this is driven by just how many staff are available. And we have a large degree of differences in the resources available between some of our municipalities along the coast, and those are up in the more Litchfield part of Western Connecticut. One of our problems also is that we do not have sufficiently trained wetland agents, nor sufficiently trained Inland Wetland Commission members. It is one of our challenges because these can be very technical reviews, and what ends up happening if the Inland Wetland Commission members or the agent really don't understand the regulations or the wetland science, then it becomes a battle of experts between the expert provided by the town, if that approach is taken, or the expert provided by the applicant. Or if there's no experts at all, then it's left to the Inland Wetland Commission to pull their hair out and decide what they think is the appropriate decision on any given application. Let's go to the next slide. This is Connecticut Department of Energy Environmental Protection Wetland Office, very complicated diagram. And I think don't worry about too much of the detail, but the fundamental thing when a violation occurs is one thing: to remember that it should always be handled at the lowest level possible. In other words, on the left, it says violation, or the top, violation is detected, is immediate court action warranted? And it says yes. You never go that way. There is really no reason. You should always go through the notice of violation strategy and say no there. You issue a citation only if you've established in the municipality a municipal ordinance on fines. So really the normal pattern is, if as immediate court action warranted is no, and you go to issue a notice of violation, which is really a cease and desist order is what comes into effect. And you don't see that here. The violation is not corrected. It comes through a cease and desist order. Notice of violation with a cease and desist. And if it's not corrected, then you go ultimately all the way down and you follow that line over to the court system. So you try always within the legal system to handle the problems at the lowest level possible. Because if you don't, the Superior Court will tell you to go back and deal with it at the level that's most appropriate. So that's really a quick capsule of this. And I know that somebody did say that they were interested in the slides. And of course, I'm going to turn it over to Kristen to talk about some of those issues and open it up for Q&A. Kristen,
Yeah,
it's over to
so
you.
we'll have Q&A just in just a moment. Just a brief overview of what we've learned today. So zoning commissions do have the authority to protect wetlands. We reviewed three core techniques that we think that are good options, including protection of riparian corridors with buffers, establishing buildable square concepts, and adopting low impact development standards. You also want to remember that federal and state authority is granted to protect wetlands to zoning commissions through an MS4 permit, Public Act 21-29, and also some court case law. Yep. And then we talked pretty extensively about the benefits of imploring wetland protections, including reduction in flooding, maintaining habitats, and improving water quality throughout the region. So first, I did want to point out some readings that you can look into some more. So we based a lot of this information off today of reports that Charles was actually the main author on. The buildable square one that we talked about today in that second section, the case for riparian corridor protections, and then also Inland Wetlands Commission practices in Connecticut. Those are our three main reports, and you can find them on our website, and they're linked here. And then we also have some other resources, but I believe there's also quite a bit of resources in each of these reports if you really want to do a deep dive into this subject. Yeah, so I think that's it from us, and we are happy to answer any questions that you have.